afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on Brazil and the BRICS. My name is David Lubin. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the Global Economy and Finance Programme, and I'm delighted to be joined by Roberto Braga on my left, who is the founder and executive director of the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas, Matthias Spector, who is Professor of Politics and International Relations at the Getulio Vargas Foundation, and online we have Oliver Stunkel, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Foundation and an associate professor at the Getulio Vargas Foundation as well. Welcome to you all. Let me make a couple of housekeeping announcements. I want to say this meeting is on the record. It's being recorded. Chatham House rules are being abandoned for now, I'm sorry to say. I'm going to ask each of the three speakers to open up by making a few minutes of comments on the theme of the session as they see it, and then we'll have a bit of discussion. I'll open it up to Q&A after that. Please, when I do open the session up to Q&A, raise your hand. A microphone will arrive at your seat. You don't need to stand up, but please do identify yourself when you ask a question. I think I've said all that I need to say by way of housekeeping, so thank you very much again for coming along. We'll start with Matthias. Please, all yours.
Thanks so much. It's a treat to be back at Chatham House. So the order of the day is the state of the BRICS and what's coming for the BRICS and Brazil within the BRICS. But I think it's useful to take a step back and try not to look at the BRICS only through coalitional politics. We're going to talk a lot about where they are and whether they can put together a coalition and what are the problems that that coalition is now facing and the opportunities moving forward. But to talk about the BRICS as a political project that precedes Trump and that precedes the current relative decay of the so-called liberal order, the BRICS is to a very large degree the latest iteration of a long-term process, which is, you can call it the rise of the global south. Some people use that expression. We can go Hedley Bull all the way back and call it the challenge of the third world to the West. There is a very powerful sense among the BRICS, and this is at the heart of the BRICS idea, that the center of gravity for world politics for a long time has not been the West, that the notion that global order is centered in the West was born in the West through norms and institutions post-1945 in particular, but one could go all the way back to 1815, that way of telling the story is a very partial way of telling the story and one that is not super accurate. That when you scratch the surface, many of the norms and institutions that govern the world were not created in the West. They were co-constituted, co-created between the West and the non-West. So, for example, the Bretton Woods institutions are not the design of Washington, are the result of very active interactions between Washington and London for sure, but many of the capitals of these so-called now large emerging countries from the global south. Human rights. If you look at the evolution of international law around human rights, it's very hard to distinguish a Western origin to that story. The story is a story of co-constitution. And the idea that the countries outside the West would form a coalition to push for their shared priorities, starting very early on with independence and national sovereignty in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the Hague conferences in the early 20th century, but then getting together around notions of strategic autonomy in the 1950s, cultural equality and self-expression, economic redistribution in the 1960s. That thread is such a powerful thread, has been such a powerful thread, and yet that's not the way we talk about international order at all. If you take your course in International Order 101 at the LSE or King's College or Georgetown or Yale, that's not the story you read at all. It's a story of the West becoming globalized in the 1990s, spreading around the world, and now a process of backlash. And now the problem is that the West is no longer committed to these rules. And the rest of the world kind of doesn't really exist. It's an Anglosphere story. Well, the BRICS is an expression of that long thread, that long story preceding Trump by a far stretch. And I think it's useful, David, to start a conversation about where the BRICS are now and where they might be going by looking at it from this perspective, not merely as a coalition that tries to get things done or express a set of principles or values or interests, but also as a long-standing project. And that will tell us a little something about the future resilience of it, I think.
I'm going to do what I thought I wasn't going to do, which is to interrupt the flow of allowing the three of you to make some opening comments. Just to ask you a question, Matthias. You were talking about emphasizing the role that non-Western countries played in forming these institutions, the Bretton Woods regime, post-war human rights conventions. But surely, yes, countries outside the United States might have played a role, but the role that they played was only viable as long as the US wasn't exercising its undeniable veto power over whatever role they wanted to play. So in a way, other countries may have played a role, but in a way it remains a US-shaped order, no?
US-shaped for sure. US created exclusively and owned and operated, I think that's a big mistake. And we're missing so much. And if we don't attend to this other side, then it's very hard to understand what's going on now and why that order may be fraying the beams.
Interesting, thank you. We're going to go online to Oliver. Oliver, the floor is yours for a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be part of that conversation. I wish I could be with you in person. I'm currently in Washington, D.C. And I'd like just to add before we start the debate a few points. I wholly agree with Matthias's initial remarks. I think that the BRICS grouping is oftentimes seen as a potential counterweight to US or Western-led structures. But if you actually read the final declaration of the BRICS grouping just published at the recent summit in Brazil, it comes across as fairly pro-status quo and even conservative. The word, I've just looked it up, the word United Nations is mentioned 31 times. It's really all about strengthening, mostly about existing structures and seeking to implement, for example, reforms in order to make the structures more functional, more representative, and more legitimate, right? There is, I do think, some tension within the BRICS grouping, and you see that sometimes in the language of leaders. For example, in Russia, it's fairly common to indeed frame the BRICS grouping as a counterweight to the G7. But if you look at what the Brazilian president says, he's actually very adamant about making sure that this is not against anyone. He keeps saying that. I mean, he said that tens of times over the past year. BRICS is not against anyone. We seek to strengthen the voices and strengthen intra-BRICS ties, which I think oftentimes is also a very overlooked dynamic. Is, if somebody asked me what was the most useful element of BRICS over the past 15 years, I'd probably say it helped Brazil adapt to a more multipolar world, learn about these other countries. I myself, as a Brazil-based scholar looking at BRICS, have been able to travel to Russia, to India, countries I didn't know that well. So I think in that sense, sort of adapting to a less Western-centric world has been one of the key elements that motivated BRICS countries to embrace this grouping. And that in part explains why so many other countries want to join, relatively low cost, and makes hedging more, makes hedging easier, diversifying partnerships, increase strategic wiggle room, but not necessarily confront the West. I think there's certainly Russia and Iran, two members that have a fairly confrontational rhetoric that does create some tension. I think there's kind of a multi-alignment faction within BRICS and a more anti-Western bloc, and we can talk about how that division makes cooperation more difficult. But all in all, I would agree with Matthias that there is, and you can see that clearly in the case of Brazil, there is a profound sense of ownership of today's order, right? It's about making it better. It's reforming it rather than undermining it. And I think we can even see that, interestingly enough, in the recent summit in China to celebrate the end of World War II, 80 years of World War II, where China actually projected itself kind of as the as a protector, as the heir of post World War II order. And secondly, just very briefly, it's fairly obvious, of course, that Trump is the first president who speaks a lot about BRICS. All previous presidents have largely ignored the grouping, and that has, not surprisingly, kind of strengthened the ethos and the BRICS identity. It underlined for BRICS members why it's so important to be part of that, to have alternatives. So I think it's certainly quite counterproductive. I don't think any country considers abandoning BRICS in reaction to the attacks by the US president, who has framed the grouping as anti-American. And finally, as I think I'm unsure about the capacity of the BRICS grouping to utilize that unique opportunity Trump has offered because of internal divisions, also expansion, which was not in Brazil's interest, which has made it more difficult to find consensus, has certainly diluted Brazil's influence in the groupings, made it somewhat less exclusive. And perhaps an example of that is when in April, the foreign ministers of BRICS met in Rio and were unable to include an issue that's dear to Brazil, which is the reform of the UN Security Council. The language proposed by Brazil was unacceptable to Ethiopia and Egypt, to new BRICS members, because it did emphasize South Africa's ambition. And of course, there's no consensus among African nations of whom should ideally be the representative of the continent in a permanent fashion in a reformed UN Security Council. So I think that's a symbol of the difficulties ahead for the grouping. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Oliver. Roberta, over to you.
Okay. Well, I don't think that you can answer the question, today's question, of whether Brazil can lead the BRICS to counter Trump without talking about narratives and information ecosystems. And at DDIA, what we do is, our mission is really to strengthen trust between communities and democracy, but we do that by conducting a lot of public opinion research and doing narrative analysis on social media and public WhatsApp groups to understand which narratives go viral, and what are we actually exposed to, and what are we believing? What is the impact of the things that we see on the internet on our actual behavior and how we see institutions of democracy? And so last year, for example, we focus on US Latino communities and Latin Americans, tracking also the flow of information in English, Spanish, and Portuguese between our region, Latin America, and the US. And last year, we did a series of polls where we tested upwards of 15 false claims and then 7 conspiracy theories to see what was penetrating the most. And what we found was that the conspiracy theories that had to do with the motivations of elites and institutions were the ones that people were most familiar with, and they were the ones that people were most believing in. So for example, one narrative was that elites are conspiring with social media companies and news outlets to keep the truth from us. Another was that there's a deep state cadre that is working to keep society from progressing, keep us down. Another was that corporations are so all-powerful that our votes don't matter in democracy. those were three narratives that we saw penetrating more than any other. And so I think in talking about the BRICS and Brazil's role, not only do we have to talk about what Brazil is dealing with right now internally with polarization and the movements that transcend borders online and how what's happening in the US connects with what's happening in Brazil. And I'll talk a little about some of those stories that get told and the impact that they have. I think we also have to talk about trust in organizations like the BRICS to begin with, because from the everyday consumer's perspective, we're not connected to BRICS. We don't know what BRICS are. We barely know what our government is doing for us. That is what we hear from people. People don't think that that their government serves them more often than not, and in the ways that they feel closest to in cost of living and things like that. I'll just wrap this up by saying there are three, I think meta-narratives is what we call them, stories that get recycled in different country contexts that I think Brazil has to grapple with, also in the context of how it engages not just the US, but other member countries of the BRICS. And those are three. One is the global control narrative. So some of the narratives that I mentioned earlier, like elites and institutions conspiring with social media companies and news outlets, like that is part of a broader global control narrative that posits that the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and the BRICS and others are trying to control society and the things that we do. We've seen a penetration of that global control narrative really deepen over the years. And in different countries, you see pushback, for example, against the United Nations, in Chile and other countries. And so that is one. The second is the election fraud narrative. I think that's not going away. It's something that with Brazil having elections next year, whoever, both candidates or the set of candidates that are competing will have to deal with that, and I think it'll come back. The story being that elections are fraudulent and can't be trusted, and the claims usually being, and I think you'll all recognize these no matter what country you're from, that one-off mistakes, delays at polling places mean widespread fraud, that dead people are voting, that non-citizens are voting. These things come up time and time again, and I expect they'll come up again next year. And the last one is the anti-immigrant meta-narrative, that immigrants are ruining the fabric of our society, pick your country, and you see that kind of, the claims underpinning that being that immigrants are the reason why our economies are in downfall, or immigrants are the reason why crime rates are up. Immigrants are a threat to society. So I think these sort of, in this context, I say these are domestic meta-narratives that Brazil has to grapple with in connection with trust in BRICS and institutions and then the government and its institutions itself. But I also recognize that these narratives are narratives that are very much mirrored under the Trump administration, and that beyond talking about national borders now, I actually think we have to talk about borderless movements online. And if we ignore how that connection happens, it won't matter much how the BRICS react, because not only will people not see it or understand it, they won't trust it at all, and they'll just kind of pull themselves further into the bubbles that they already self-select into to hear whatever validates their values and identities. So.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Since you're all Brazilian, I want to kind of ask you in particular about Brazil's relationship with BRICS. One of the things that is often, almost truistically said about BRICS is that it kind of contains countries that are both non-Western and anti-Western, and the existence of those two camps makes cooperation difficult because different countries have very radically different conceptions of global order and different conceptions of how to deal with the United States. So I want to ask you particularly, how you all see Brazil's role in that. I mean, do you see that the Lula government as essentially non-Western or anti-Western? How would you put Lula, President Lula on that spectrum? And even putting aside that division that exists within the BRICS, there is, I think, a kind of competition for leadership. Even in other words, even if you couldn't describe BRICS as being divided along these anti versus non-Western lines, there are big countries that have big ambitions. Brazil, India, China, Russia, all want to exercise some kind of leadership role in global affairs. And I wanted to ask you about how you see Brazil, how you would describe Brazil's ambitions with respect to a leadership role in global affairs and within the BRICS. And really, I guess that ultimately boils down to how you think of Brazil's relationship with China. On the one hand, it is, forgive me, conceivable to think of BRICS without Brazil. It's not really conceivable to think of BRICS without China. And so whatever competition is playing out among among the biggest countries within BRICS, it's kind of competition among the second tier, if you like. And I wonder how you see the relationship. There are a lot of questions there. Matthias, let me ask you first.
So three very difficult questions, and you give me
all,
4 minutes. Let me try. President Lula comes from a foreign policy tradition that precedes him, but he's the best exemplar of today. That goes like this. If you're Brazil, that means you're a big country in one sphere of influence that for almost 100 years now, more than 100 years now, has been by and large dominated by the United States. So priority number one, if you're Brazil, is to try and, you can't move away geographically, but what you can do is try and build up some strategic autonomy. Like the French have their own version of strategic autonomy, Brazil has its own. Born intellectually in the 1960s and expressed time and again through different administrations. And President Lula is an heir to that tradition and has built on that tradition. And that tradition is not anti-Western at all. It's a tradition that says that if you're in the sphere of influence of the United States may well be the provider of lots of public goods, including international security to some degree, but at the same time, that's the closest thing you have to a threat to your country. That irony is very difficult to capture if you're not in a sphere of influence. But Brazil is. So how does Brazil go about that? Well, it tries to diversify, that's the verb, it tries to diversify its ties. And one of the interesting things that's happened to Brazil since the end of the Cold War is that Brazil has very effectively played out that policy program by diversifying its trade to the degree that now Brazil is more dependent on China than it is dependent on the United States. I mean, Brazil's luck today is that Trump is the president of America, not the president of China. Because if China were to slap Brazil with 50% tariffs, we'd be in very serious trouble. Yeah. Whereas if it's America, of course it affects Brazil very negatively, and lots of people are going to suffer. Not only in Brazil, by the way, also in America. But Brazil can deal with it, and it can cope with it, because when push comes to shove, Brazil only exports about 12% to the United States, and trade with the United States accounts for under 2% of national GDP. China's a different story. So within that, what's the BRICS good for? Well, the BRICS was built originally to try and drive the message that the center of gravity of the world is not the North Atlantic alone. There was never an idea that let's build up the BRICS as an alternative to global order. That was never Brazil's position. And mind you, that was not China's position either. And it has not been Russia's position. We can discuss what Russia and China are doing in the BRICS. What they're not doing is saying, well, here we have an alternative conception. So every time people ask, well, what's the BRICS alternative conception? There ain't one, because that was never the purpose in the first place. The idea is that the world is plural. That's what President Lula represents, is the idea that you do not have a US-led order. You haven't had one for a long time, that there are multiple centers of power, and that in the world today, you better engage that diversity, because otherwise you fall prey to what happens when a character like Trump comes to office. I mean, I invite everyone to very closely listen to Trump's speech before the UN General Assembly yesterday, and then watch President Lula's speech. And it's interesting because these are the mirror opposite. Who would have thought that it'd be a BRICS country defending the United Nations and the principles of the United Nations and the rules-based order. So what I hate about these questions, actually, David, is that I end up defending Lula, which is not what I want to do. It's not my natural inclination, but here we are. So anti-Western for sure not. That said, of course, within the BRICS, there are profound divisions, and the fact that Iran has come into BRICS adds another level of difficulty. And as you say, to a large degree, the BRICS has been, it's not centered around China, but China has been a major player within the coalitional politics within the BRICS. All of that granted. The idea that this is an anti-Western group is, I think, is just factually wrong, and it's certainly not how it's seen as from Brasilia.
Very interesting, thank you. Roberta, Matthias doesn't want to defend Lula, but the reality is there might not be a Lula to defend after the end of next year. We're approaching an election season where opinion polls are very finely balanced and it's clearly up for grabs against the background where many Latin American elections seem to be kind of tilting to the right. So imagine a Tarcísio presidency or a Bolsonaro Jr. presidency or whatever. How do you think Brazil's relationship to BRICS might change? I mean, is it absolutely self-evidently fatal for Brazil's membership of the BRICS if the Brazilian right wins the election next year? Or will Brazil's relationship with BRICS kind of morph into something else?
That's a great question. So the interesting thing about Matthias's comment, if you can bear to listen to the 58 minutes of Trump's speech at the UN and Lula's, is that actually you see both of those sets of narratives playing out in both countries individually. So the dichotomy is that they exist and they're competing internally in domestic politics in Brazil and domestic politics in the US. So to your question, I think Brazil has over 30 political parties, and somehow in the last 4 years, whether we can talk about the effects of social media on debate or perception gaps that are created with our information ecosystems, but I feel like the narratives that have become most relevant are connected to the very far right and the very far left. And the other political parties mean nothing. It's become like a cult of personality politics like we always had, but more modern day. I think that a lot of people have been saying that what's been happening with Trump and the things that he's saying give Lula a boost, and that it positions him to compete or to win next year. Maybe it's because my team and I are living in like the darkest corners of the internet. I actually wouldn't say that yet. And I think that what recently just happened, the trial of Jair Bolsonaro, hearing people talk, there is a lot of distrust in the institutions in Brazil, the Supreme Court, and ironically, the narrative of defending democracy and strengthening democracy is actually a narrative that both sides sort of uphold. But it means fundamentally different things to the two sides. And I think that people interpret what that means through really fundamentally different lenses. But it's interesting because that makes it really hard to argue against. Because for a faction of our country in Brazil, a defense of democracy means removing our justice. It means restructuring the court. It means, setting people free, battling against censorship, whatever. And for the other side, it means something else. So I think to your question about BRICS, we already sort of saw what that could look like under Bolsonaro. And I think there's the president and the president's ideology, and then there's the Brazil's position. Maybe this is naive or too optimistic, I don't know that the next president, if he is someone like Bolsonaro, would abandon BRICS entirely, because I think that person will be pragmatic, albeit ideological, pragmatic enough to understand that they need to have the strong relationship with China and Russia. And Brazil has a history of having diplomatic relationships that are strong with all of the countries. And so I think that maybe the fora itself won't look the same, but I do think that they wouldn't pull back entirely. We'll see. So,
I mean, I guess one point that might support that view is exactly as Matthias said, Brazil's dominant economic relationship is with China. So even a right-wing president in Brazil that might feel ideologically distant from Beijing feels economically close to Beijing. And so the cost of walking away from the organization would be relatively high, albeit that clearly it's difficult to imagine a Tarcísio presidency having the same kind of relationship with Beijing as Lula does.
although I will say, and this will be my last comment on this point, is even inside of Brazil, we are seeing, at least online, a growing anti-China sentiment. And so, interestingly, a lot of the narrative and rhetoric that is kind of percolating in the US is being brought into Brazil, and the people that identify with the far right-wing movement, or with Bolsonarismo at least, have taken on a lot of those same mantles and the symbolism of it. So people in Brazil understand that China's huge economic power. They also have the visible evidence of China's power. They see the cars, a lot of Chinese cars, complain about it in conversations that we've had with Brazilians. And so it could be the case, I guess this is like the other side of the coin, is that whoever comes in next, if they are incredibly ideological, would do what Trump is doing, which is push back on the rhetoric piece, even if the actions don't match the rhetoric. So
that's a fascinating point that you're making about perceptions of China and Brazil, because in a way it kind of mirrors one of the economic problems that China has in promoting itself as a kind of responsible alternative pillar of global order, which is that it's running a big trade surplus with many developing countries, and many developing countries, including Brazil, are kind of fed up of receiving a bunch of dumped Chinese manufactured goods and hostile trade policies coming from countries like Brazil and Turkey and Egypt and others have been an important kind of phenomenon. Oliver, bearing in mind what you've heard from Roberta and Matthias, how do you see the balance between BRICS as a relevant organization versus BRICS as a coherent organization? So there's a kind of gap there, isn't there? That there's lots of demand for at least discussions or exploring alternative conceptions of global order, or providing developing countries with organizations that give them an opportunity to engage in this kind of strategic hedging or bamboo diplomacy, or however you want to describe it. But is that how much more than symbolic does BRICS allow that hedging to take place?
Before I answer that question, I just want to make a very brief comments on what the others have said. Please. First of all, when you talked about if Tarcísio gets elected or a right-winger gets elected in Brazil, who's distant ideologically from China, I keep thinking about the slightly excruciating speeches that I have to read on a regular basis by Xi Jinping. And it's, I think, surprising to many that I think there's more overlap between a Brazilian right-winger and Xi Jinping, particularly on social issues, than one may suspect. If you listen to Xi Jinping criticizing cash transfer payments like Bolsa Familia because it makes people lazy, I think that would place him on the conservative side of the ideological spectrum in Brazil, and of course, an extremely conservative worldview when it comes to the role of women, who are now mostly mentioned in the speeches because they need to have more children. So that's kind of an interesting detail about Chinese domestic politics, which isn't actually that far from a more conservative worldview, of course. But I do want to mention that the vast majority of BRICS members have no intention whatsoever to break with the West. UAE, Ethiopia. I mean, BRICS has now 10.5 members. I say 10.5 because Saudi Arabia has not responded to the invitation, which is quite remarkable. About half of our articles about BRICS falsely say that Saudi Arabia is a member. But Saudi Arabia is obviously keen to utilize the BRICS invitation to extract concessions from Washington. And this is what I think a lot of countries do, right? Even Turkey actually may join. It's explicitly saying we'd like to join, but of course doesn't want to abandon NATO, for example. So I think this hedging, this utilizing BRICS in order to to have a more productive relationship or have more leverage vis-a-vis Washington is really a key theme in addition to strengthening bilateral relationships. And just one issue about if Bolsonaro comes back or Tarcísio comes back, I think we've had that case. Bolsonaro was president. He hosted the BRICS summit, right? And that's quite remarkable because he did travel during his presidential campaign to Taiwan to say that if I become president, we will end our relations to communist regimes. What happened? Trade between Brazil and China grew constantly under Bolsonaro. And during the first visit of Bolsonaro, who claimed to be the most and who was arguably the most pro-American president in Brazil's history, during the first president's visit to Washington in February 2019, Trump demanded two things from Bolsonaro. First, remove Huawei as a component provider of the 5G network in Brazil. Second, provide explicit rhetorical support to Trump's threats of potential military invasion against Venezuela. Bolsonaro could not deliver any of that. Despite being a Trump fan, returned to Brazil, and the economic elites of the country made very clear we have no intention to oppose China. And the military said there's no way in which we will support US threats against Venezuela because it would set a precedent which could be then used against Brazil in the future. So I have no doubt whatsoever that whoever gets elected will continue to be part of BRICS because the dynamics that Matthias described are structural. They are largely unrelated to ideological preference. So Temer, happy BRICS participant, Bolsonaro, happy BRICS participant, despite his initial foreign minister saying, largely referring to Maoist China and the China virus during the COVID pandemic. So I think these kind of these structural issues are unlikely to significantly alter Brazil's commitment to BRICS. You may have perhaps fewer embraces and hugging during the family photos, etc. But it's largely going to be, I think, quite similar, and we see that when we look at Milei or others who attack China on the campaign trail, but in the end are quite unwilling to actually confront it. And the same is true on the left. Lula is not taking any significant steps to reduce Brazil's dependence on the United States. Brazil continues to be a major non-NATO ally, continues to have ample security cooperation with the United States, and Brazil will not unilaterally change that because of the ideological divergence between Lula and Trump. So, and just to finish regarding the issue of what's possible within BRICS now, sort of in terms of additional initiatives, we have the BRICS Bank, also the new development bank, which does some work, but it's certainly not going to challenge existing institutions. I think we have some desire by some members to increase non-dollar currencies. And I think that depending on how aggressive Trump will move forward against individual BRICS countries, you may have some movement in that direction. But I would still say Brazil is closely committed, or is committed to preserving its ties to the West, and despite Lula's rhetoric, I think has no active desire to create an alternative currency, for example. I think all this talk about a BRICS currency is largely to mobilize domestic constituencies, and I don't really see that many additional initiatives. I think that the secret sauce of BRICS and the secret of its sort of success has precisely been not to engage in too many activities, because that's the only way to deal with these profound divergences between member countries, above all India and China, of course, but many others that make a more concrete, let's say, the creation of a new body incredibly difficult.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's open it up to Q&A. Thank you very much. There's also Q&A coming in from online. I've got some questions here. I'm going to give a bit of priority to those in the room here who've made the effort to travel. Yes, at the back. If you don't mind letting us know who you are. And actually, before you ask your question, I just did want to say to you all that the latest issue of The World Today, which is Chatham House's magnificent quarterly magazine, is out now. The autumn edition is out now. Has a cover story by Amitav Acharya on the sort of post-West global order in what he describes as a multiplex order, and I encourage you all to have a look at it. Sorry, thank you, go ahead.
Thanks very much. My name is Blaise Bakish. I'm with the Parliament magazine in Brussels. I wanted to hear the panel's thoughts on the upcoming EU-Mercosur deal that is yet to be ratified in the EU. These are negotiations between the EU and the 4 South American countries, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. Negotiations have been going on for 25 years. French farmers are furious about meat exports. Germans want to sell their cars into South America. But I suppose the EU sees it as a way of Trump-proofing Europe. Does Brazil consider the deal to have the same effect? And also, I suppose, do you think there are any conflicts or even benefits of Brazil having membership of both BRICS and the Mercosur trading bloc? Thanks.
Matthias?
Yes, Brazil sees it as a way of Trump-proofing Brazil, as do all the other Mercosur countries. But as you correctly pointed out, lots of intra-group trouble to get that deal up and running. And the other drama, of course, is that because the deal has been 3 decades in the making, it is not really a deal cut out for the 21st century. It's very much a late 21st century. It's very much a late 20th century, early 21st century deal. So is it going to resolve the many problems that afflict European and South American economies? No. But would it be a signal? Yeah, my goodness, absolutely. And yet the difficulties are as you say, they are. I agree with your assessment.
Very good. Yes. Second row, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Human. I'm a PhD researcher on financial crime with focus on Russia, China, and Iran. Since all BRICS members face systematic challenges with corruption and financial crime, and given the presence of Russian oligarchic capitals in emerging economies such as Brazil and Turkey, do these governance issues undermine BRICS' credibility as an alternative to Western-led institutions? Thank you.
Oliver, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I somewhat take issue with the premise of the alternative, of course, of BRICS being a substitute or a counterweight or alternative to existing institutions. No doubt these challenges exist, and I think that BRICS may, to some extent, be a platform to discuss some of them, even though I think the key issues are mostly around, say, the BRICS Business Council, for example, or the identification of opportunities to increase cooperation on specific diplomatic challenges, even though that is oftentimes limited due to divisions. So I think that is certainly undermining individually, or that may be undermining individually countries, but I don't see BRICS, for example, as kind of a key platform to take joint action when it comes to addressing them. I think most of these countries deal with that in previous and other alternative existing structures that have been in place prior to the rise of BRICS.
Understood. Yeah, please go ahead.
Do the two things of
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So 2 things. The underlying assumption of your question is that the BRICS are trying to build an alternative to the Western set of rules, which I don't think is the case. I don't think we have evidence that's good enough to suggest that that's the way. But the other thing is, if we worried about Russia weaponizing global financial systems to get away with all sorts of crimes, then the leadership surely should be British. It's the City of London that is the laundromat of Russian oligarchs. It's not the BRICS countries at all. So if one is to be committed to a rules-based order, then one should have one's feet hold to the fire, in the West as well.
And I would just add to that I guess the answer to your question depends in whose eyes is the credibility undermined, because at least in the Brazilian case, Brazil has managed to undermine itself through history of corruption, then dealing with corruption, then walking back results of that because new governments came in. Now something similar happening. So there's like a lot of suspicion in the inconsistency of Brazil's government institutions among the public. Related, not related to financial crime, Brazil is deals with a lot of very creative scams and fraud that impact people in their day-to-day lives. And the country is still, I think, it's done a lot, but it's still struggling to deal with that evolving. So talking to folks on the ground, I think there's a lot of, as I mentioned, distrust. But I think that those two things combined, no matter what government comes in, I think that sets the stage for some.
Great. Could I do another thing? So here's one instance in which Trump and the BRICS actually converge, and that's on corruption. The undermining of the institutional architecture to push back against corruption and push for cleaner government, that's been in decline for a long time. But now with the set of bills that Trump has introduced, the ending of that system is one that has been incredible and will be incredibly beneficial to many of the BRICS countries.
So which legislation you talking about?
Ending the Anti-Corruption Act,
right.
Ensuring that you can actually weaponize corruption in third countries and
right.
Allow your own leaders to get away with it.
I understand, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right, I understand. I'm going to go online, and I want to take a couple of questions from online, taking up a couple of points that came out in your comments earlier. Oliver, you mentioned the new development bank in Shanghai, and a number of you have mentioned, sort of alternative currency arrangements. And it does seem to me, at least, that in a way, the one most reliable common denominator among BRICS members is this common desire to escape dollar dominance. It's the one thing, whether you're just non-Western or anti-Western, whether you're India or China, everybody wants to kind of escape dollar dominance. And I think the reason, or one reason for that, is that escaping dollar dominance or being a victim of dollar dominance has been a feature of developing countries in relationship with international capital markets for 4 or 5 decades. And so it's kind of building on a decade's worth of built-up frustration that many developing countries have about the negative consequences of being in a dollar-dominated international monetary system. So the first question comes from the remarkable Rosemary Foote. What does the panel think of the new development bank? It's operating in ways that offer local standards in assessing environmental and social impact of loan project. Founder member staff decide on projects, and there is an absence of co-financing. Dilma Rousseff is thinking about ways the bank might be able to offer an alternative development model. That's the sort of key phrase that I want to take from this question. Should this be seen as a potential challenge to dominant development models, or is it overly ambitious? And I want to link that with another question that has come in online from Mervyn Lim. Considering that Brazil is one of the most crucial components in the BRICS initiatives for de-dollarization, due to it being the largest economy in Latin America and one of the world's biggest commodity exporters, bearing in mind that commodities are mostly settled and denominated in dollars, would BRICS members extensively try to keep Brazil's ideology in their interest? So I don't know, you can interpret that how you like, as a question about BRICS and currencies, BRICS and the dollar. Matthias, how do you see these issues?
Right, let me start with the dollar story. Lots has been written about it, but it's all, I think, premised on a fundamental misunderstanding. It's true that President Lula himself has brought up the issue time and again. The aspirational goal is to move towards a world in which the dollar is no longer the main anchor of the global financial system. But he's always been super vague on what the timing would be, and he said nothing on the technical side of the story. And the reason for that is that nobody in his team, none of his ministers is in favor of that idea. I don't think it's accurate to suggest that Brazil would prefer to be today in a world that is not dominated by the US dollar. Brazil is fully integrated into the global financial system. Brazilian banks are a powerful force, as every bit as much as they are in, banks are in India. And the brouhaha, I think, is disconnected from the reality of the conversation about where things should be going. In fact, we know for a fact that many of Lula's closest advisors have asked him time and again to tone these down. But this is one of the main pillars of Brazil's traditional left, all the way from the 1960s onwards. And President Lula, when he speaks along those lines. And yet, in the last BRICS meeting, and Oliver will be able to give us more precision than I will, in the last BRICS summit, that tone was dialed down quite significantly, partly because they know that this could invite Trump's wrath, but partly because it's very clear that there is no actual project to move away from the dollar in any significant way. If anything, the single largest threat to the US dollar as the pillar of the global financial system is changes coming from the United States and the uses of blockchain and the way artificial intelligence will intersect with finance, and the way financial regulations are being weaponized to try and punish countries that are seen to be anemic. So in that sense, the true revolutionary power is not China, and is certainly not Brazil. It's the United States itself. I think one needs to get out of the mindset that goes, there's the Anglosphere, which is status quo, and then there's the rest who want to change the rules of the game. No, the driver of changes to the rules of the game is the United States. And wait until reform comes to office in this country to see what...
Yes, Samia, I know who you are, but please introduce yourself.
Hi, Samir Puri, Director of Chatham House's Centre for Global Governance and Security. Really good panel. Thanks so much. I want to just take on and ask a question to the panel about something I think that's often missed about BRICS in the West. And there's a lot of skepticism about BRICS in the West. David, I know you've got a bit of skepticism you've voiced in other forums yourself as well. And I think the skepticism comes from holding it to an artificial standard of collective action. So it says, well, they're too diverse, there's too much of a contrast, therefore they'll never have unity, they won't move in one. The question I have is it more that the BRICS has significance for deepening the networks bilaterally within the membership? And if that's the case, and the one example that struck me is after India had 50% tariffs, Modi phoned Lula, and I don't know what they talked about, presumably trade opportunities and other things. Is there evidence so far, putting China aside, which is Brazil's biggest bilateral trade partner, of deepening trade or cultural or other networks, or tourism even, among the other BRICS members? Because that, to me, seems like a very good driver of change for all the BRICS members indefinitely in the future. Just very last comment. Oliver, in one of your books, you very, I think, clearly mentioned that a lot of non-Western countries had historically refracted their knowledge of each other through the West and through Western publications, institutions. And I think it's a building on that point of breaking through that point of having to have a controlling hub as a broker of relations. Thanks.
Oliver, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think those issues are certainly a key element of intra-BRICS debates. I think Matthias made this comment, I think sort of, when Lula spoke at the second inauguration of Dilma Rousseff as president of the New Development Bank, he literally said, I wake up in the morning and ask myself, why do we all still use the dollar? And I think that reverberates in sort of parts of his more nationalist, anti-American subset of his electorate, perhaps. But I can't really sense any tangible initiative in that sense. And I agree that the recent BRICS summit was very technical. Brazil sought to emphasize issues around climate change. In that sense, the BRICS summits functioned a bit like the G20, where sort of host countries can project themselves, can emphasize issues, can engage in setting the narrative, setting the tone. participating actively in debates that the host government deems relevant. Now, there are, and this is often overlooked, by the way, there are every year around 100 BRICS meetings. So they occur all the time in, just for tourism, defense, the national security advisors meet. Brazil doesn't really have one, but it's sort of that there's the equivalent of that joining on a yearly basis. All things like the environment, statistics, and I've interviewed many bureaucrats from BRICS countries and about what they think about the grouping. And one comment I've heard many times is that it was thanks to BRICS that they ended up having a more global understanding of the world, a less Western-centric understanding of the world, having participated in workshops in South Africa and in other countries they hadn't known. And that's why, for example, I think for Brazil, it's useful to have Indonesia as a new member, a country Brazil knows very little about, right? So overcoming this knowledge gap, I think, is crucial. Now, when you look at the specifics, I mean, this is sometimes a quite tortuous road ahead. In some cases, we've had visa waivers to facilitate tourism. In others, it's more difficult. University cooperation remains in the world profoundly Western-centric. And I see this with my own students who would certainly prefer to spend a semester in Barcelona or London or Rome than in Shanghai. And I think that continues to be a challenge. I think Brazil has made tremendous progress in gaining a better understanding of BRICS countries, but there's still a very long road ahead. I think, for example, vis-a-vis India, the number of India specialists, or people who spend a significant amount of time in India and Brazil, is very, very limited. But certainly, I think that is, when you ask people within the member governments, that's a much more tangible and common point of conversation than establishing structures to challenge Western dominance in the world. Absolutely.
If I can take that last comment, Roberta, and put a question to you. Oliver's saying that at the end of the day, China culturally isn't that exciting, being a closed society. And I want to kind of link that to the comment you made earlier about growing hostility towards China in Brazil. And I wonder, as the US arguably becomes a more closed society, can you imagine a scenario where Brazilians kind of think, there's not much to kind of divide these two countries here, so maybe my views about China will become more friendly?
This is a good question. So I think when we talk about narratives, I always argue that we actually need to do a lot more targeting. So for example, the drivers of engagement with misinformation online, for example, are not what we think they are. They're not low levels of education or low access to information. It's actually really high levels of interest in politics, conspiratorial tendencies, and how much you consume hyper-partisan narratives in partisan spaces online. And so I think even as the United States becomes more closed, I think public perception of the United States and Brazil will not fundamentally change much among the people that are already hugely engaged with the United States in movements like the Bolsonaro movement. I think they already admire the United States for much higher level symbolic elements than the day-to-day action. And even still, when you hear people processing, the people we've spoken with, for example, that believe a lot of misinformation in Brazil, they are not misinformed in the sense that they are actually overloaded with information, but it's all information being processed through influencers, creators, journalists that have left mainstream and gone on to YouTube Spaces, for example, or other spots. So I think that there's a certain element of there is nothing the United States can really do to ruin its own reputation among a faction of the people in Brazil that are already highly engaged with it. That said, in our studies, for example, 66% of people are not those people. They are uncertain, they're skeptical, they are processing information somewhat critically, albeit not trusting anything they see really online. And so I think among those people you could see some shifts, but...
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'm very sorry to those of you here and online whose questions I couldn't get to. It means we just have to do another one of these soon. Meanwhile, thank you very much to all three of you. Fantastic discussion. Thank you very much for joining.